For this module, I'd like to welcome Father Liam Kelly. Liam is an Irish Franciscan, currently based in Ennis, Ireland, and he is currently on the staff teaching theology at Mary Immaculate College, University of Limerick. Liam has wide pastoral experience, having been involved in various pastoral activities since his ordination, including school chaplaincy, parish missions, and formation work in the Franciscan community. He completed his theological formation at the Gregorian University in Rome, but more recently, he completed his doctoral studies at the University of Durham in England, with a reading of the early Franciscan movement in the light of René Girard's mimetic theory. So we're very happy to have you today, Liam, and thank you for joining us. And perhaps you might like to add another word or two there yourself, maybe in light of your current areas of interest, research, or activity, just to complete the bio.
Well, thanks, Eugene. Yeah, my interests remain connected to the work of René Girard and mimetic theory, which involves reflection on a range of important ideas around desire, about conflict, about conversion, and I suppose intersects in many respects with Christology and important themes in the Bible. I'm also interested in the early Franciscan movement and the theology and spirituality which emerged from the Franciscans in the 13th century. So they remain my two main areas of interest in research.
Good. Well, today we're going to limit the focus quite a bit. We're limiting ourselves to the very final articles of the Creed, the resurrection of the body and life everlasting. So I suppose relative to your wider interest, this is pretty specific and pretty focused. So the Creed itself then affirms belief in the resurrection. Belief in the resurrection is obviously the foundational belief for us as Christians. We accept it as a statement of fact. How has the doctrine of the resurrection, or has it been the core doctrine of the Christians since the very beginning, would you say? Is it the central issue?
I think it is, Eugene. St. Paul in the letter to the Corinthians says that if Christ has not been raised, then our preaching is in vain and your faith is in vain. So that's a pretty strong statement coming from St. Paul. And I suppose one of the things I'd like to say about the resurrection is that the disciples of Jesus knew perfectly well that people don't die and come back to life. I think sometimes we imagine that the ancients or people who lived a long time ago were a bit confused about these things. They weren't as clear about the laws of nature, perhaps, as we are. Mm-hmm. In many respects, I think they had more clarity about the laws of nature because we live in a society which shields us from the reality of death. We often speak of people passing rather than people dying. And in many ways, we're protected or shielded from the reality in a way that most people living in a pre-modern society were not. So I think it's important to say that the disciples and the contemporaries of Jesus, they knew the difference between life and death, and they knew that people don't come back from the dead. And so when the New Testament is speaking about the resurrection of Jesus, there's clarity and there's an awareness that this is not something that happens ordinarily. And it might be objected that many first century Jews believed in resurrection, that they had a sense or a concept that the body would rise again. But again, it's important to say that most Jews who believed in the resurrection believed that it would come at the end of history, the end of time, and it would involve everybody, not that it would happen in the middle of history to one person. Yeah. So I don't think the disciples of Jesus were expecting or anticipating his resurrection after his death. I think it did, in fact, surprise them. And you get that sense in the New Testament, we're really dealing with a novelty. We're dealing with something which is new to the experience of the disciples, and they strain at times in their language to express what has happened. But it is a real event, and it is something new, and it is connected with God.
Well, I think you get a sense of that strain of the language, if you like, when you compare the gospel accounts of the resurrection appearances with St. Paul. St. Paul is very terse, we'll say in the first letter to the Corinthians, chapter 15. He's very terse in saying he appeared, and he doesn't give us any details of where, when, or how, or what the risen Christ looked like. So, what do you think Paul's very terse, condensed statements really tell us about the faith of the early Christians in the resurrection? He's obviously writing maybe 30 years or before, say, St. Luke or Matthew have written their gospels, which are much more expansive.
Yeah, and that's an interesting question, Eugene. St. Paul is writing the letter to the Corinthians maybe about 20 years after the events of the death and resurrection. So it's certainly still within living memory. And he refers in 1 Corinthians 15 to the appearances of Jesus, that Jesus appeared to 500 people, a group of people. And he indicates in the letter, that though some have died, many are still alive. Therefore, you can go and talk to them. You can ask them about this experience. So he's certainly aware of the appearances. And he lists others to whom Jesus has appeared: Peter, the apostles, the 500, and lastly, himself. So scholars would say St. Paul is drawing on the earliest Christian tradition of the resurrection, what we call the kerygma, those very terse formulas which speak about Jesus having died for our sins, having been buried, having been raised from the dead, and having appeared. So when St. Paul is talking about the resurrection, one of the things which he doesn't mention, but which the Gospels do mention, which I think is significant, is that Jesus was first encountered or seen by the women. And in all four Gospel accounts of the resurrection, the first people to experience an encounter with the risen Jesus are the women who go to the tomb. And this is obviously a source of embarrassment for the early Christians, who have to tell the story of the resurrection, who have to speak about it, because the testimony or the witness of women at this period in history counted for nothing. There was no credibility given to women's testimony. And in fact, an early opponent of Christianity called Celsus said that the whole Christian story is the invention of a group of hysterical women. So you can see that St. Paul is somewhat embarrassed to include that information in his letter to the first letter to the Corinthians. He talks about the appearances, but he leaves out the fact that the very first people to witness them were women. And I just think it's very interesting that a later literary tradition, the Gospels, and we most people assume the Gospels are a good deal later than the letters of St. Paul. They include the earlier tradition that it is women who encounter Jesus at Easter, who discover the empty tomb. So you have an earlier literary tradition which gives us less information in a way than a later tradition, which nonetheless is capturing something very, very important. And I suppose it would indicate to scholars that if you were to invent the resurrection, if you were to fabricate it, the last thing you'd do is have women as your primary witnesses. So it's just an interesting contrast between the Gospels and the letters of St. Paul.
Yeah, I think that is quite interesting, because Paul himself says, "I pass on to you what I had myself received." So he's obviously conveying a tradition that was circulating. So you have obviously two kinds of tradition there circulating. You have Paul's very brief statement, and then you have another tradition, certainly, that the women were the earliest witnesses. It's an interesting contrast to see, or how elements of the earliest tradition are communicated differently by the two sources that you are looking at there. When we go back to the creed, or particularly to that last article of the creed, it talks about the resurrection of the body. And I think obviously there that the reference is to our own bodies, because earlier on in the creed, in the part dealing with the Son, it talked about the resurrection of Christ himself. But then at the end of the creed, we're acknowledging or proclaiming a faith or a belief in the resurrection of the body, our own body. So what exactly is going on there? What lies behind that statement, if you like?
Yeah, well, I think we distinguish between the resurrection and what we might call resuscitation or revivification. We know from accounts in the gospel that on 3 occasions, at least, Jesus raised people from the dead. We have the son of the widow of Nain, the daughter of Jairus, and famously Lazarus.
Yeah.
Now, none of these were resurrection events as we understand the resurrection, that through his power, Jesus brought these people back to life, but they remained within time and space and under we might say, under the shadow of death. Their earthly life continued until they died again. So there's no transformation or glorification which we associate with resurrection. So resurrection is definitely different from something like resuscitation. You don't rise to continue this earthly life conditioned by time and space. You are in a new relationship to history and a new relationship to God after the resurrection. And I think, maybe a little bit speculatively, but I think that one of the things resurrection does is that it allows the potential of our lives, which are in many respects limited and conditioned by so many things. Our lives never reach their potential. We're often, through our own sinfulness, through anxieties and fears and regrets, we're often limited and we never reach a fully and perfected life. And I think resurrection is also about that. It's not just the continuation of the life we're living now. It is the perfection or the fulfillment of the life that God wants us to live.
It reminds me of Irenaeus, the glory of God is the human person fully alive, so that it's when we reach our fullest, the fullness of life, in a way, it might be a way of describing what happens, if you like, in the resurrection of the body. But I think that distinction between resurrection and resuscitation is an important one for us all, right, to remember as well. I think I've been noticing in recent years that more and more people tend to visit the graves of their departed family members and friends. And people who believe in the resurrection of the body might ask, what happens to the body then once it's buried in the grave? And how can we continue to relate to the deceased person when their body is no longer alive, if you like, in that sense? Yeah.
Yeah. And I suppose now you and I, Eugene, we're talking about death in the abstract. We're talking about death and resurrection. But when death visits us and when we lose someone we love, a parent or a sibling or a spouse or a friend, death is completely different. It causes great trauma in our lives. Because it removes from our lives someone that we have formed a deep and significant relationship with. I like the phrase in the Old Testament, how David and Jonathan, their souls were knitted together. And in many respects, when we form relationships, again, with parents or siblings, our souls are knitted to them, and death unravels that. It removes from our lives someone who has loved, understood, accepted, told the truth to, encouraged, and so many other things. And I suppose in the immediate aftermath, our focus is on the body, on the body of that person who meant so much to us, because their embodied presence is the most immediate thing to us. And I can see how, in the case of the loss of a loved one, a great deal of attention is addressed to the body or to the grave. But I think we know that all that person meant to us is not contained in the body, or is no longer limited or contained or located in the physical remains. We know that the love and the acceptance and the connection, all of that is located elsewhere now. And as Christians, we believe located in God, in the living one, in God who is the living one. So while Christianity affirms the bodily resurrection and shows great dignity to the body, and as people in grief will often find comfort visiting a grave, I think we also know that the full person that loved us is no longer limited to this time and space, and no longer limited to the mortal remains. St. Paul, in the letter to the Romans, says that Jesus, having passed through death, is now Lord of the dead and the living. And I think as Christians, that's an important thing for us to hear, that Jesus is Lord of the living and the dead. And that invites us to think of the person we loved as now living in glory with the Lord. And when I say living in glory, I don't mean some kind of glitzy Hollywood pageant, I don't want to impose some kind of earthly idea of glory on them. It simply means they live an existence which is no longer under the sway of death. They are no longer subject or conditioned by death the way we are. In John's Gospel, when Jesus dies on the cross, he reveals God's glory. In other words, that God is never subject to death. And I think the very things that we loved about the people who died, their warmth, their honesty, their humor, their beauty, all of these things, they continue now connected to the very source of all these good things. But they are purified or being purified of the last vestiges of death. And so they become, in fact, more radiant. They're glorified now in their new existence. And I think that's how we should try and think of them, not limit our grief and our loss to the physical remains, but the person that we loved and who loved us is now connected to God and is purified of anything that is of death. And so their goodness, their beauty, their humor is even more radiant and more glorified. And I think as Christians, all of this happens because we believe that Jesus rose. It is through his resurrection that this is possible for us.
And I suppose there, just as you talk about that, Liam, it shows how closely faith and hope are connected, that we're moving into the realm of hope as well as faith when we make statements like that, which I think leads nicely into that last element of the creed, a conviction about life everlasting. We believe in life, the resurrection of the body, and life everlasting. And I wonder today, have we lost our sense of life everlasting, or our conviction about it waned in recent years?
Yeah, I think that's true to say, Eugene. I think we have waned in our conviction about life everlasting. And one of the reasons for that is that we live in a consumer or consumeristic society. And when I say that we live in a consumer society, I'm not primarily talking about economics, because the consumer society affects every aspect of our life. It affects our relationships. It affects how we use our free time. It affects how we approach education. It has a very particular way of directing us. And it basically keeps us locked into the present moment and gratifying ourselves and basically buying and selling and keeping us fixed in this moment. And we lose touch with two very important qualities or characteristics of faith in the Old Testament, which is memory and prophecy. So memory is that capacity grounded in faith where we look back at the good things God has done for us, either individually in all of our lives or as a people. And I think a consumer society often ridicules or diminishes the importance of memory or of history. And similarly, prophecy, because God is always coming into the now. God is coming in to create a new future. But very often, if we're fixed or stuck in a consumer mentality, we're not open or receptive to what God is trying to do or doing with us now. So I do think that one of the problems is the society we live in. It keeps us distracted, and we lose our touch with both memory and prophecy. Another thing which I think is very apt is treated in Pope Benedict XVI's letter Spe Salvi, where he addresses the question of everlasting life. And he says, like, if we're going to be honest, most of us dread the idea of living forever, because our experience of life today, your life, my life, there's quite a lot of boredom in it. There's quite a lot of frustration. We're often correcting our mistakes or just passing time. So you can think of life as units of time stretched out infinitely. And as Pope Benedict says, the idea of being on that trajectory forever is actually quite terrifying. So he says that when Jesus speaks of life, I came that you may have life and have it to the full. Or when he talks about abundant life, he's not talking about units of time. He's talking about those moments which we all experience when we have, for example, a connection with another person around the truth, or we have an experience of beauty, which just lifts us out of ourselves. Or maybe if you're into sport, you're an athlete and you play a fantastic game of football, and you're playing to your best ability with the team that are working well, the exhilaration that comes from it. Or if you're an artist or a musician, where you learn a piece of music and your ear and your limbs together create this beauty. So all of these are kind of peak moments of happiness, and there are many others, and we experience them, but we can't hold on to them. They're glimpses of heaven. And Pope Benedict says that the life that we're entering into is that life. It's not a long, continuous sequence of moments. It is these peak moments where we're utterly fulfilled. We couldn't be bored, where we are alive, and that is our context forever. And that certainly takes the dread of the idea of everlasting life for me.
I suppose the other thing, just as you mentioned, dread there and everlasting life, one of the topics or one of the phrases that was in vogue in earlier generations, I suppose, was the last things, that phrase, the last things, death, judgment, heaven, and hell. And they're not something you hear much about today. Certainly, we don't talk about the last things so readily. I wonder why is that? Or maybe that's a good place for us to end off, just talking about the last things as a round off to our little discourse on the Nicene Creed. So, what would you say about those last things, or how we might view them today, really?
Yeah, and they were called the last things partly, I think, because they deal with the end of the human existence, but also they came at the very end of the theology course. They were the last tract that the theologian would deal with: death, judgment, heaven, and hell. And I suppose theologians have always been very sensitive to one of the great biblical sins, the sin of idolatry. And idolatry is any attempt to reduce or limit the mystery of God to terms which are human, and I suppose to translate the mystery of God into human terms. And this is something we're apt to do. And theology tells us that God is ultimately incomprehensible, that even when we see God face to face, we won't know God the way we can know things within our experience here. And so theologians, and perhaps influenced quite a lot by Immanuel Kant, a philosopher of the 18th century have been increasingly reluctant to speak about things which touch on the mystery of God and things which can't be known through sense perception and so on. And theologians have often avoided or cautioned against trying to reduce God's plans and purposes to an historical timeline. And we still see that today, people reading into events, historical events, some certain fulfilled or completed purpose of God. So theologians and perhaps preachers too have been very cautious, I think, in recent times, not to speculate on the mysteries which are associated with God. And all of these things, death, judgment, heaven and hell, they really are things that belong more to the next life than to this. So any attempt to speak about them is likely to reduce them or limit them. And so I suppose we're in a bind because we should be talking about them, particularly, for example, the way I just spoke about everlasting life. We should be encouraging and cultivating hope for these things in our lives today, but we should also be careful not to reduce them to purely human terms. I might just mention another rather a recent situation where the former Archbishop of Canterbury was interviewed on the BBC, and much of the interview was around his mishandling of a prominent Church of England man accused of, and indeed guilty of, abuse. And he was asked very pointedly, if this man was alive today, would he forgive him? And he said yes. And this, of course, became, I think, the most controversial part of the interview, because as a Christian, he is obliged to forgive. We're obliged to forgive. Jesus tells us to. But on this side of heaven, we can't experience forgiveness in the way that we will experience it in the next life. We know that in the next life, God's mercy and God's justice will be established. And our surest route into this is through forgiveness. But here and now, we live within the confines of time and space, and our forgiveness might end up actually wounding or hurting others. Who we can't take responsibility for other people's forgiveness. And I think that's just an example of where we're living between the fulfilled and perfected, which God promises us, and the temporal and imperfect life that we're living here in faith.
I think that neatly rounds off our little series on the Nicene Creed, because we began with a reflection on the person of the Father, the first person of the Trinity, and we began there with mystery, and so at the end too we end in mystery, anticipating the mystery that awaits us at the end of life, which is also a matter of faith for us all. So thank you, Liam, for joining us for this conversation. We appreciate your contribution very much. So thank you.
Thank you, Eugene.